On Sunday, March 10th, the roast was still steaming when my brother said I cost more than I contributed. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't smile like it was a joke. He just said it like he was reading from a balance sheet. My mother nodded and added that utilities had gone up since I moved back in. My father kept cutting his meat the way he does when he doesn't want to take sides. No one laughed. No one corrected it. The word settled there at the table with us. Burden. I had always known I was the one who came back, the one who didn't leave for good. 3 years ago, when Carter Heating and Air started bleeding cash after a slow winter, I left Chicago and moved back to Columbus. I told myself it was temporary. I was 32, a licensed CPA with a remote position at a mid-sized firm. I could work from anywhere. Home seemed practical, but practicality doesn't earn applause at a dinner table. Daniel, my older brother, runs daily operations for my dad's HVAC business. He's been in and out of that shop since high school. My mom, Linda, keeps the household steady the way she always has. My father, Richard, built the company from one truck and a borrowed ladder. In this house, history matters more than spreadsheets. I didn't argue when Daniel said groceries cost more because I prefer fresh produce. I didn't defend the extra internet speed I paid for myself so I could work without lag. I didn't remind them that I'd spent the past 3 years reconciling vendor accounts, after midnight, renegotiating supplier contracts, and making sure payroll cleared on time. I just set my fork down. There's a moment when you realize a sentence isn't frustration, it's identity. They weren't saying I was temporarily expensive. They were saying I was fundamentally unnecessary. I finished my water. I told them I understood. That seemed to surprise them more than anger would have. My mother muttered something about not being dramatic. I didn't slam a door. I didn't cry. I went upstairs, sat at my desk, and opened the same shared company spreadsheet I'd opened almost every night for the past 3 years. Rows of numbers, vendor balances, upcoming tax deadlines, payroll schedules for 8 technicians who depended on those deposits landing on Fridays. For a long time, I stared at the screen. Then I closed the file without saving. The next morning, Monday, I logged into my firm's system at 8 a.m. sharp and did only the work that had my name on it. I didn't check Carter Heating and Air's accounts. I didn't reconcile last week's invoices. I didn't review the supplier discount terms expiring at the end of the month. No announcement, no speech. If I was a burden, then I would stop carrying what wasn't mine. That night at dinner, no one mentioned the spreadsheet. They talked about an upcoming commercial installation and how tight margins were getting. Daniel complained about customers delaying payments. My father said he'd figure it out. I nodded and passed the salt. Upstairs, my laptop stayed closed. And for the first time since I moved back, I let the numbers sit where they were. By Wednesday, March 13th, the house felt exactly the same. The coffee maker clicked on at 6. My dad left for the shop at 6:30. Daniel's truck rumbled out of the driveway 10 minutes later. My mom watered the same kitchen plant she'd had since I was in high school. Nothing looked unstable. Nothing sounded urgent. Upstairs, my laptop stayed closed. For 3 years, my evenings had followed a rhythm no one saw. After dinner, I would sit at my desk, open the shared company spreadsheet, and reconcile what had happened that day at Carter Heating and Air, vendor invoices, equipment orders, payroll adjustments. I tracked which supplier offered early payment discounts and which charged penalties after 30 days. I made sure our sales tax filings matched revenue across Franklin and Delaware counties. I watched the business line of credit like it was a pulse. No one had ever asked how it worked. They just assumed it did. That Wednesday night, I washed my plate, wished everyone good night, and went upstairs without opening the file. I didn't log into the accounting software. I didn't check whether the parts supplier in Dayton had been paid. I didn't confirm that Friday's payroll batch had been queued correctly. I told myself I wasn't punishing anyone. I was stepping out of a role I'd never formally been given. Thursday afternoon, I overheard Daniel on the phone in the kitchen. He was talking to one of our regular suppliers, Midwest Climate Parts. His tone had that tight edge he uses when he feels cornered. "We sent that check," he said. "It's probably just a delay." I knew we hadn't. The invoice had been sitting in the folder I used to review every Monday and Thursday. It wasn't malicious. It was predictable. Daniel handled installations and crews. Paperwork bored him. My dad trusted that if something were serious, I'd flag it. This time, I didn't. That evening, my mom mentioned that the grocery bill had come in higher again. She said it lightly, but the word burden hovered between us like humidity before a storm. I nodded and Venmo'd her for my portion without comment. It wasn't the money that stung. It was the assumption. On Friday morning, payroll went through. At least, most of it did. Around noon, one of the technicians, Marcus, called the house, asking why his overtime hadn't been reflected correctly. I could hear Daniel pacing in the living room, flipping through papers. "It must be a software glitch," he said. It wasn't. Overtime calculations required manual confirmation before final submission. I had always double-checked them Thursday nights. Upstairs, I sat at my desk with my own firm's client files open. Depreciation schedules, audit notes, clean defined responsibilities. Work that had my name attached to it in writing. There's a difference between being needed and being acknowledged. I had confused the two. By Sunday evening, the vendor invoice was still unpaid. A late fee would post automatically at 31 days. The supplier hadn't cut us off yet. They were reviewing the account. Downstairs, my dad talked about an upcoming commercial installation at a church on the east side. He said margins were getting tighter. Daniel blamed slow-paying customers again. I passed the salt and listened. No one asked about the spreadsheet, and I let the numbers sit where they were. By Tuesday, March 19th, the first shipment didn't arrive. The commercial installation on the East Side Church was scheduled for Thursday morning. Daniel had promised the pastor new rooftop units before spring services ramped up. The crew showed up at the shop at 7 a.m., coffee in hand, waiting for the delivery truck from Midwest Climate Parts. It never came. Instead, Daniel's phone rang. I was in the kitchen refilling my water when I heard his voice sharpen. "What do you mean it's on hold?" he asked. There was a pause. "We've been ordering from you for 20 years. He walked into the living room, lowering his voice, but not enough. "We sent payment." Another pause, then quieter. "Review." Since when I didn't need to hear the other side to understand what had happened. Midwest Climate Parts had moved our account into review status because the outstanding balance had crossed their internal threshold. The unpaid invoice from 2 weeks earlier had triggered it. That was policy. It wasn't personal. Daniel ended the call and stood there staring at the wall for a moment before turning toward the hallway. He saw me and forced a shrug. "Supplier mix-up," he said. "They're double-checking something." I nodded. I didn't correct him. At the shop, later that afternoon, the technicians were told the install would be pushed back. Marcus, the same technician who'd called about overtime, muttered that rescheduling meant lost hours. My dad tried to smooth it over, promising it was temporary. Temporary is a comfortable word when you believe someone else is managing the details. That evening, a white envelope arrived in the mail with the State of Ohio seal in the corner. My mother set it on the kitchen counter like it was just another bill. My dad opened it after dinner. "Quarterly filing reminder," he said almost dismissively. "We've got time." He set it beside the loan agreement binder in the cabinet by the pantry. I watched him slide it in without opening the full contents. For 3 years, those reminders had never made it to the counter. I'd filed before they arrived, or at least the same day. Sales tax reconciled across counties. Deadlines calendared in red. Payment confirmations saved in a folder labeled compliance. Now the letter sat there, unopened, beyond the first page. Upstairs, I opened my own work laptop and finalized a client's audit report. Everything balanced, everything documented. Clean lines, clear accountability. Downstairs, I could hear Daniel pacing again. He was calling customers, asking about outstanding payments. He sounded frustrated, almost wounded, like the world had shifted without warning. It hadn't shifted. It had continued. By Friday afternoon, the supplier still hadn't released the shipment. The church project was officially delayed. Daniel blamed slow-paying clients. My dad blamed tight margins. My mother blamed rising costs. No one blamed the ledger. On Sunday, March 24th, another email came in this time, flagged as important. I recognized the subject line even before my father said it out loud. Covenant documentation request from the bank. Updated financial statements required under the terms of the business line of credit. My dad frowned at the screen. "They do this every year," he said. They did, but this time the numbers hadn't been reconciled. I passed him the salt and kept my voice neutral. "You should probably review that soon." He nodded, distracted. Upstairs, the shared spreadsheet remained untouched. And for the first time, the first crack wasn't theoretical. It was visible. By Monday, March 25th, the email from the bank had been printed and set on the dining room table like it was just another piece of paperwork. Covenant documentation request. Daniel read aloud, stumbling slightly over the phrasing. Updated financial statements required within 10 business days. My father waved a hand as if the language itself were exaggerated. "They do this every year," he said again. "Routine. Routine only works when someone is maintaining it." The letter from the state of Ohio was still tucked inside the cabinet near the pantry, folded into the loan agreement binder. The supplier invoice remained unpaid. The spreadsheet upstairs remained closed. At breakfast, my mother asked if I could at least glance at the bank thing. She said it gently, as if she were asking me to check the weather. "I'm focusing on my firm's workload this quarter," I said evenly. "If you need outside accounting support, you should hire it." Daniel let out a breath through his nose. "We don't need outside support. We just need to get through this week." That phrase, "get through this week," had covered a lot of structural issues over the years. At the shop, tension showed up in small ways. A technician questioned why overtime approvals were inconsistent. Another mentioned that the equipment delay had cost them a referral. I stopped by only to drop off mail and could feel the shift in the room. Conversations lowered when I entered. Not hostile, just tight. That afternoon, my father called the bank and put the call on speaker in his office. The loan officer's voice was calm, measured. They needed updated income statements, balance sheets, and confirmation that certain financial ratios remained within agreed thresholds. "We've always met our obligations," my father said, a touch defensive. "We just need the documentation," the loan officer replied. "Without it, we're not in compliance." Not in compliance. The phrase hung in the air longer than it should have. When the call ended, Daniel turned to me. "You already have those reports built, don't you?" I met his eyes. "They haven't been updated since I stepped back." He frowned as if I'd admitted to withholding something essential. It would take you, an hour? It would take clarity about my role, I said, and authority to make decisions if something needs to change. Silence settled between us. My father rubbed his forehead and muttered that we were making this bigger than it is. Back at the house that evening, I opened my own laptop and logged into a secure client portal for a construction firm in Cleveland. Their financial ratios were clean. Their reporting deadlines tracked automatically. Clear roles, clear expectations. Downstairs, I could hear Daniel and my father going through file drawers in the office nook off the kitchen. Papers shuffled. The loan agreement binder was pulled out again. I recognized the thud of it on the table. "We just need the latest statements," Daniel said. Where did she save them? The word, she was soft, but it carried weight. In the past, I would have come down with my laptop, explained where everything lived, and outlined next steps. I would have reassured them that we were fine. Instead, I stayed in my chair. By Wednesday, a second email arrived from the bank, polite but firmer, reminder of the 10-day window, documentation pending. My mother stood in the doorway of my room that night. "You don't want to see your father stressed," she said quietly. I looked at her. I didn't want to be called a burden either. She didn't argue. She just sighed and went downstairs. The deadlines didn't move, and for the first time, the pressure wasn't emotional. It was procedural. On Monday, April 1st, a new car showed up in the driveway before my father even left for the shop. It was a small sedan with a magnetic sign on the door that read, "Holloway Bookkeeping." A woman in her 40s stepped out, carrying a laptop bag and a thick accordion file. She had sensible shoes and the alert posture of someone who had learned to protect herself with paperwork. My mother introduced her in the kitchen as the accountant we hired. Then she looked at me as if waiting for a reaction. I didn't give her one. Her name was Janice Holloway, and she wasn't family. That was the point. My dad had finally done what I'd suggested without saying he was doing it. He called it temporary help, like the word temporary could keep pride intact. Janice sat at the dining room table with the loan agreement binder, the stack of vendor invoices, and the printed bank emails. Within minutes, she had questions. Not emotional questions, concrete ones. "Where are the reconciled statements for the last quarter?" she asked. Daniel shrugged. "We have QuickBooks." "That's not what I asked," she said, still polite, but firmer. I stayed upstairs, working through my firm's client calls, listening to the muffled cadence of numbers and deadlines filtering through the floorboards. It was strange, hearing someone else say out loud what I'd carried quietly for years. By Wednesday, April 3rd, Janice had been to the shop twice and back to our house once. She moved like someone counting minutes because she'd seen what unpaid minutes become. That evening, I came downstairs to refill my tea and found her standing at the counter, making copies of a letter with the State of Ohio seal. The same reminder my father had brushed off. She glanced at me. "Emily Wright?" I nodded. "I'm not trying to alarm anyone," she said carefully, "but you have a multi-county sales tax exposure here. If filings are inconsistent, the state can assess penalties and interest. Sometimes they audit." From the living room, my father's voice tightened. "We're not getting audited." Janice didn't argue. She simply pointed to a printed discrepancy report she'd created, pages of highlighted lines, dates, and missing entries. She set it on the table like a physician placing an X-ray in front of a patient who doesn't want to see it. Daniel leaned over it, frowning. My mother pressed her lips together. My father finally asked the question he should have asked months ago. "How long to fix it?" Janice hesitated. "It depends on what's missing and who has authority to make corrections. But this isn't a weekend project. The words landed heavier than the paper. After Janice left, my mother followed me up the stairs and stood in the hallway outside my door. "See," she said quietly, "it's serious. We need you." I looked at her, and something in me shifted. Not rage, not satisfaction, just clarity. For 3 years, I had absorbed their stress as if it were my responsibility to buffer it. I had been the quiet fix so they could stay comfortable. And they still called me a burden. I shook my head. "Janice is paid for her work," I said. "She's doing her job. I'm not stepping back into unpaid silence." My mother's eyes softened, but she didn't apologize. She just said, "Your father can't handle this." I thought of the dining table, the word burden, the way everyone let it sit there. "I'm not punishing him," I said. "I'm letting him see what he's been ignoring." Downstairs, Daniel opened the loan agreement binder, again flipping through it with impatience. Papers rustled like dry leaves. And for the first time, I understood that stepping back wasn't an absence. It was a boundary that made the truth visible. The next morning, Janice emailed my father a summary of risks and an urgent recommendation: meet with the bank in person before the compliance window closed. My father stared at the screen, and his face went pale. The meeting was no longer optional. On Thursday, April 4th, we walked into the Fifth Third Bank branch on Broad Street, 10 minutes before the appointment. The lobby smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and coffee. My father wore the same navy blazer he reserves for serious conversations. Daniel carried the loan agreement binder under his arm like it was proof of something solid. Janice had emailed a summary the night before, but she wasn't invited. This was a family matter now. I hadn't been invited either. I came anyway. No one stopped me when I followed them into the small, glass-walled conference room. The loan officer, Mr. Harlan, stood when we entered. He was in his late 50s, steady-eyed, the kind of man who had spent decades explaining consequences without raising his voice. "Richard," he said to my father. "Daniel." His eyes shifted to me. "Emily Carter," I said. "I've assisted with financial reporting in prior years." That was as far as I went. We sat. "Mr." Harlan opened a folder and slid a printed compliance report across the table. Clean columns, highlighted lines, dates. "As outlined in your agreement," he began, "the business line of credit requires quarterly reporting to maintain covenant compliance. We've received partial documentation, but updated financial statements are still outstanding." My father leaned back. "We've always met our obligations." "I'm not questioning intent," Mr. Harlan replied calmly. "I'm addressing documentation." Daniel shifted in his chair. "We're in the middle of reorganizing some internal processes." Mr. Harlan nodded once. "Understood. However, without current income statements and balance sheets, we can't confirm that your debt service coverage ratio and liquidity thresholds remain within agreed limits." The language was clinical. It left no room for pride. I watched my father's jaw tighten. "What happens if we don't submit in time?" Daniel asked. Mr. Harlan didn't hesitate. "The bank has the right to freeze the revolving credit line pending review." Freeze. The word felt different in that room than it had in email. "That's extreme," my father said. "It's procedural," Mr. Harlan answered. Silence settled. I could feel Daniel's frustration building beside me, like heat under a closed lid. Mr. Harlan turned a page. "There are also discrepancies between reported revenue and tax filings, flagged in our internal monitoring. We recommend immediate clarification." I didn't speak. Not yet. My father glanced at me, then a quick look that carried expectation. For years, I would have stepped in, explained ratios, outlined corrective steps, softened the room. Instead, I waited. Mr. Harlan's attention returned to me. "Mrs. Carter, you've handled these submissions before." "Yes," I said evenly. "In prior quarters. And currently, I am not in a formal role with the company." The distinction mattered. Daniel exhaled sharply. She stepped back. Mr. Harlan's expression didn't change. "Then, I strongly advise appointing someone with defined authority to prepare and certify accurate statements before the compliance window closes." Defined authority? The phrase echoed in my mind. My father cleared his throat. "We'll get you what you need by Monday, April 15th, Mr. Harlan said. "After that, the account enters review." Review. We stood. Chairs slid against carpet. Papers were gathered, but not organized. In the parking lot, my father turned on me. "You could have clarified a few things." "I did," I said, quietly. "I clarified my role." Daniel shook his head. "This didn't have to be like this." I looked at the bank building behind us, solid brick, no emotion in its windows. "It always had to be documented," I said. For the first time, the risk wasn't theoretical or hidden in spreadsheets. It was institutional. And the clock was now visible to everyone. Monday, April 15th, arrived without ceremony. At 8:42 that morning, while I was reviewing an audit file for a client in Cincinnati, Daniel's name flashed across my phone. I let it ring once before answering. "They froze it," he said, not bothering with hello. I didn't ask what he meant. "The line of credit," he added. "Effective immediately. Pending review." I pictured the conference room at the bank, the clean columns on Mr. Harlan's compliance report. The phrase, "after that, the account enters review." "Did you submit the updated statements?" I asked. "We sent what we had." That wasn't an answer. By mid-morning, the shop felt different. I drove over after lunch because my mother had texted, "Can you just come by?" The service bay doors were open, but no trucks were leaving. Daniel stood near the front office window, with his phone pressed to his ear. My father sat at his desk, with the loan agreement binder, open flipping pages, as if a clause might change under pressure. Marcus and the other technicians were gathered near the tool cabinets. Conversations were low, not angry, just unsettled. When Daniel hung up, he turned to me, eyes sharp. This didn't have to happen. The accusation hovered between us. "The deadline was clear," I said evenly. "You could have updated the statements," he shot back. "You knew what they needed." "I told you what I needed," I replied. "Defined authority, clear responsibility." My father looked up then. "This is family," he said. "We don't need paperwork to prove that." I met his gaze. "The bank does." Silence. By 2:00, a formal notice had been emailed, confirming the freeze on the revolving credit line. No additional draws permitted. Existing balance subject to review. Continued access contingent upon submission of complete financial documentation. Without the credit line, equipment purchases had to be paid in cash. Payroll would have to rely solely on receivables. The church project had already been delayed once. Another postponement could cost the contract entirely. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "We can't operate like this." "You were operating like this," I said quietly. "You just didn't see it." That afternoon, my father called 3 long-term customers, asking for early payment on outstanding invoices. 1 agreed to partial payment. 2 said they'd pay on their usual 30-day terms. Cash flow doesn't bend for pride. Around 4, Daniel cornered me near the back office. "If we lose that church contract that's on you," it was the first time the blame had been direct. I felt it land, not because it was accurate, but because it was public. The technicians were within earshot. For a moment, the word burden flickered back into the room unspoken but present. "I stepped back," I said. "I didn't sabotage anything." He stared at me, jaw tight. "You knew this would happen." "I knew there were risks," I said. "I told you that." The difference between warning and fixing had never been clearer. By evening, the mood in the house was brittle. My mother moved quietly between the kitchen and living room. My father made calls behind closed doors. Daniel paced. Upstairs, I opened the shared spreadsheet for the first time in weeks. Not to correct it, but to look at it. The numbers hadn't changed themselves. Deadlines still blinked in red. Vendor balances still waited. I realized then that stepping back had exposed more than financial weakness. It had exposed a system built on assumption. The freeze wasn't the end. It was the proof. And, for the first time, I understood that if I chose to step forward again, it wouldn't be as a daughter trying to be useful. It would have to be as something else entirely. On Tuesday, April 16th, my father called for a family meeting like we were still dealing with hurt feelings instead of a frozen credit line. He set the loan agreement binder on the dining table, the same table where I'd been labeled a burden a month earlier, and opened it with both hands, slow and deliberate, like the weight of the paper might make him look in control. Daniel arrived straight from the shop, smelling like dust and machine oil. My mother had already laid out coffee cups, as if caffeine could soften consequences. I brought my laptop downstairs and set it on the table closed. No one spoke for a moment. The quiet felt different now. Not avoidance, a kind of forced attention. "We need to fix this," my father said finally. He didn't say, "We need to fix what we ignored." He didn't say we were wrong about you. He just said, "Fix this," like it was a leak in a pipe. Daniel leaned forward. "The bank wants updated statements. They want explanations. They want ratios." My father's eyes flicked to me. "You know what they want." For years, those words would have been an invitation. This time, I heard them as a transfer, a handoff of responsibility, without any change in respect. I didn't take it. "I can explain what the bank requires," I said evenly. "I can also explain what I require if I'm going to be involved." My mother's shoulders relaxed, as if she'd been holding her breath. "Emily, please. Your father hasn't slept." "I didn't sleep either," I said, and kept my voice quiet. I just did it silently. Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "So what, you're going to teach us a lesson?" The word lesson hung there sharp and defensive, like he was trying to turn my boundary into cruelty. "No," I said. "I'm going to stop being the safety net you don't admit exists." My father's jaw tightened. "We fed you, we housed you, and I kept your company compliant," I replied, still calm. "Those are both real. One doesn't cancel the other." I opened my laptop. Then, not to rescue, but to show. I pulled up the shared spreadsheet and scrolled. Red deadlines, unpaid vendor balances, missing reconciliations, a blank space where quarterly statements should have been. "This is what I stopped doing," I said. Not because I wanted the business to fail, because I didn't have a role. I had an expectation. My father leaned in, eyes narrowing at the screen, like he could accuse the numbers of betrayal. Daniel stared longer. The anger in him shifted into something quieter, recognition maybe, or fear. My mother's voice softened. "We didn't realize you were doing all that." That sentence was the closest thing to an apology she could reach without losing her footing. I nodded once. That's the problem. The room stayed still while the truth settled in. Then I laid out what I could do without crossing my own line. I would outline the documentation the bank needed. I would identify gaps. I would coordinate with Janice, who was already paid and already working. I would attend the next bank meeting if asked. But I would not sign anything. I would not promise to cover losses. I would not be the invisible fix again. Daniel's eyes flashed. So you're helping, but not helping. I'm clarifying, I said. My father sat back defensive. We don't have time for your principles. You don't have time for assumptions, I replied. That was the moral break for me, not shouting, not storming out, but stating it plainly. I would not trade my dignity for their comfort. My father looked down at the binder. My mother stared at her coffee. Daniel rubbed his forehead like he was trying to erase the last month. Finally, my father asked quieter, "What do you want?" I didn't answer immediately, because the question wasn't what I wanted. It was what I was willing to become in this family from this point forward. And that decision was still forming. On Friday, April 19th, my father asked me to meet him at the shop before the technicians arrived. The air inside the service bay was still cold from the night. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. He stood at the same metal desk he'd used for years, the one with old invoices pinned to the corkboard and a faded photo of our first company truck taped to the wall. The loan agreement binder was open in front of him again. This time, it looked less like authority and more like an anchor. I spoke to Mr. Harlan, he said. His voice was quieter than usual. He'll give us a short extension if we show a corrective plan. He wants statements certified. He wants a responsible party. Responsible party. He said it like it tasted unfamiliar. Daniel came in a few minutes later, carrying a coffee and the kind of exhaustion you can't fake. He didn't argue today. He didn't accuse. He just sat down. My father cleared his throat. We need you. Not because you're family. Not because you owe us. Because the system required someone who could do what I'd been doing all along. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I'm willing to step in, I said, but not as an extra pair of hands. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, bracing. What does that mean? It meant terms, not emotional terms, structural ones. I told him I would prepare the statements and coordinate with Janice, but the company had to formalize my role as financial director with decision authority over reporting payroll systems and vendor payments. Compensation had to be defined. Access had to be logged. And if my name was going to be attached to bank submissions, I needed protection, an indemnification clause, and shared liability structures approved by counsel. Daniel stared at me like I'd started speaking another language. My father tried to soften it. We can't afford lawyers right now. You can't afford not to, I said evenly. This is exactly how you got here. There was a long silence, the kind that forces someone to admit they underestimated the ground they were standing on. By noon, my father had called a business attorney he'd avoided for years because the hourly rate offended his pride. The attorney's name was Mark Ellison, a Columbus-based small business counsel recommended by our insurance broker. He arrived in the afternoon in a wrinkled suit and asked bluntly who actually controlled the finances. No one answered right away. That was its own confession. Mark reviewed the loan documents, the bank's notice, and Janice's discrepancy report. He didn't scold. He just explained exposure the way doctors explain lab results. If the bank decided we were too risky, they could keep the line frozen. Vendors could tighten terms. Payroll could be threatened. It wasn't theoretical anymore. My father's shoulders slumped slightly at the word payroll. He'd built his whole identity around taking care of people, and now that identity had a price. By Saturday, April 20th, my father signed an agreement naming me financial director with equity options tied to performance and compliance milestones. Daniel was required to route vendor approvals through my system. Janice stayed on as paid support. The operating agreement amendment was drafted to include my authority and protections. The tables hadn't turned because I yelled. They turned because paper finally matched reality. On Monday morning, we held a short meeting at the shop before crews headed out. My father stood in front of the technicians, clearing his throat the way he does when he's about to make an announcement he'd rather avoid. He said I would be overseeing financial operations going forward, that reporting and payroll would run through my office, that questions should come to me first. Marcus raised his eyebrows, surprised. Daniel stared at the concrete floor. My mother, standing by the doorway, looked like she didn't know whether to feel proud or ashamed. I watched my father's face as he said it. He didn't call me a burden. He didn't call me anything. He simply acknowledged the structure he'd depended on without naming. And that acknowledgement was its own consequence. The bank extension bought us time, but it didn't buy us trust. That had to be rebuilt under scrutiny, one document at a time. On Monday, May 6th, I signed a lease for a one-bedroom apartment in the Short North Arts District. It wasn't dramatic. No boxes stacked in the driveway. No slammed doors. Just a quiet signature on a 12-month contract and a set of keys placed in my palm. The bank had lifted the freeze the previous week after we submitted certified financial statements, a corrective compliance plan, drafted with Mark, and updated tax filings, coordinated with Janice. The extension held. The ratios were within acceptable thresholds once properly documented. The revolving credit line was reinstated conditionally, with quarterly reviews scheduled in advance. Conditionally. That word no longer scared me. It felt honest. At the shop, payroll ran on time that Friday without confusion. Vendor balances were brought current under structured payment terms. The church contract was salvaged, though margins were thinner than my father would ever admit. Daniel now routed every equipment approval through the reporting system we implemented. He didn't argue about it anymore. The system worked because it had names attached to it. On Wednesday evening, my father stood in the doorway of my new apartment, holding a small toolbox. "I figured you'd need shelves," he said, not meeting my eyes at first. He didn't apologize for the word burden. He didn't revisit that Sunday in March. He simply measured the wall above the kitchen counter and began drilling with the same steady hands that built his business from nothing. Halfway through, he paused. "I was wrong to think what you did wasn't work," he said, still focused on the level in his hand. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't theatrical. It was acknowledgement. "That mattered," I replied. He nodded once. Back at the house, my room was already empty. The desk where I'd closed the spreadsheet that first night stood against the wall, cleared. The silence there no longer felt heavy. It felt finished. At Carter Heating and Air, my title now appeared on formal documentation: Emily Carter, Financial Director. My compensation was processed like anyone else's documented tax visible. My authority was written into the amended operating agreement. The bank correspondence came to my secure company email, not to the kitchen counter. No one called me a burden again. Not because the word was banned, but because reality contradicted it. My mother visited the apartment the following Sunday with a casserole dish and a softer tone. Daniel stopped by the shop office one afternoon and asked without sarcasm how debt service ratios were trending. Respect didn't arrive as applause. It arrived as procedure. I still drove to the shop most mornings. I still worked long evenings during reporting cycles. But I locked my own front door at night. I paid my own rent. I chose when to show up and when to step back. Stepping back had revealed the truth. Stepping forward had required terms. I was never the burden. I was the structure they depended on without seeing. And now that structure had my name on it. If you've ever been labeled something that didn't fit who you truly are, I'd love to hear your story. Share your thoughts below about family responsibility and the kind of justice that doesn't shout. If this story resonated, consider following along for the next one.